A tiny West African nation you've probably never heard of just made a decision that could reshape the entire continent's future. And Washington, Paris, and Brussels are quietly scrambling to respond. Guinea-Bissau's move isn't just about changing regional alliances. It's the latest domino to fall in what's becoming the most significant geopolitical realignment in Africa since the Cold War ended. What's happening right now in the Sahel isn't a minor shift in regional politics. It's the construction of a new African power structure, and the stakes are far higher than most people realize. For decades, West Africa has operated under an invisible framework. The major powers, France, the United States, and increasingly Europe as a bloc, have maintained their influence through military bases, trade agreements, and political relationships that stretch back to the colonial era. These weren't always forced arrangements. Many governments in the region saw Western partnership as the pragmatic choice, a way to access capital, military support, and international legitimacy. But something fundamental has been shifting, and Guinea-Bissau's decision to align with the Alliance of Sahel States, or the AES as it's known, represents a critical inflection point in that transformation. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the AES actually is. It's not just another regional bloc. The AES emerged from the military movements in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, three countries that have sequentially undergone military transitions over the past few years. These weren't random coups. They were responses to a specific grievance: the perception that Western military presence, despite decades of investment and thousands of troops on the ground, had failed to defeat terrorism and extremism in the Sahel. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso and Assimi Goïta in Mali began to ask a fundamental question. If the West has been here this whole time, and terrorism is actually getting worse, what exactly is the point? That skepticism transformed into action. These countries began closing military bases to Western forces, breaking security partnerships, and most provocatively, turning toward Russia and other non-Western powers for military support and training. But here's where the story gets more complicated. The AES isn't simply a rejection of the West. It's the foundation of something actively being built, a coalition based on African sovereignty, military cooperation, and control of the continent's most strategic resources. The bloc isn't just talking about independence. It's creating the economic and military infrastructure to back it up. And with Guinea-Bissau's entry, the implications just became dramatically more significant. Think about West African geography for a moment. The Sahel is landlocked. It's vast, it's resource-rich, but it doesn't have direct ocean access. That's always been a vulnerability. Any landlocked region has natural limitations on trade, on military projection, on the ability to control its own economic destiny. Trade has to move through other countries. Logistics become complicated. You're dependent on your neighbors for access to global maritime networks. This has shaped Sahel geopolitics for centuries. But Guinea-Bissau changes that equation entirely. Located on the Atlantic coast with functioning ports, Guinea-Bissau gives the AES something it didn't have before: direct access to the ocean. That means the Sahel states can now bypass existing trade routes that run through countries still aligned with the West. It means new logistics networks can be established that aren't dependent on Western-controlled ports or shipping infrastructure. It means resources from the Sahel, and the Sahel is incredibly resource-rich. We're talking gold, uranium, strategic minerals, can now move directly to global markets without passing through intermediaries who might be sympathetic to Western interests. This isn't abstract. This is about control of supply chains. This is about economic independence. When you control how your resources leave your territory, you control the narrative around them, the pricing, the partnerships. The Western influence over the Sahel has always been built partly on this geographic reality. Now that's changing. But there's another dimension that makes Guinea-Bissau's entry even more strategically significant. It's not just about ports and logistics. It's about something deeper. It signals that the AES's appeal is spreading. Guinea-Bissau isn't in the Sahel proper. It's in coastal West Africa, in a different sub-region with different challenges and different colonial histories. If the AES can attract a country outside its original geographic footprint, it suggests the coalition's ideology, the idea that African nations should organize around their own sovereignty rather than inherited Western relationships, is resonating across borders. This is exactly the kind of momentum that creates cascade effects. When one country makes a major geopolitical pivot, it changes the calculations for neighboring countries. They start asking themselves, are we on the right side of history? Should we be reconsidering our own alliances? Are we leaving ourselves isolated or exposed by staying committed to partnerships that other countries are abandoning? These aren't questions that happen in a vacuum. They spread through regional networks, through business communities, through military institutions. Guinea-Bissau's move makes the next move by another West African country slightly more likely. And that's how coalitions expand. But here's where things get interesting. Because while the AES is expanding and consolidating, there's one country that's become the focal point of this entire continental struggle: Cameroon. And understanding Cameroon's situation reveals the real stakes of what's happening. Cameroon is positioned at a crossroads, and not metaphorically. It sits at the intersection of West and Central Africa. It has influence in multiple regional organizations. It's geographically positioned between the expanding AES bloc to the north and west, and other Central African states that are still more firmly within Western orbits. Cameroon also has something that matters enormously in geopolitical terms. It's perceived as a swing state. It's not yet fully committed to the AES alliance, but it's also increasingly skeptical of Western presence and increasingly interested in African-led alternatives. That makes it valuable to both sides. The AES sees Cameroon as the key to expanding their coalition southward and eastward, towards Central Africa. If Cameroon joins, it opens doors. If Cameroon remains neutral or uncommitted, it at least doesn't oppose expansion. But what does the West see? The West sees Cameroon as a critical anchor point. Losing Cameroon would mean the AES bloc extends from the Atlantic Ocean in Guinea-Bissau across the entire Sahel and down into Central Africa. That's a continuous band of territory united around a rival vision of African organization. That's not a regional bloc anymore. That's a fundamental restructuring of African geopolitics. And more than that, it's a direct challenge to Western military and economic interests across a vast territory. So the pressure on Cameroon is immense. From both sides, the AES is working to bring Cameroon into the fold, to offer incentives, to demonstrate the benefits of membership. The West is simultaneously working to keep Cameroon committed to existing partnerships, offering its own incentives, making sure Cameroon understands the costs of abandoning the relationship. This is the invisible struggle that most international news coverage completely misses. It's not being fought with armies yet. It's being fought through diplomatic channels, through trade offers, through military aid packages, through backroom negotiations in capitals around the world. But it's real. And it matters more than most people understand. Because Cameroon's decision will essentially determine whether the AES remains a Sahel-focused coalition or becomes the foundation of a truly continent-wide restructuring of power. Now let's talk about why this matters beyond just abstract geopolitical positioning. Because the expansion of the AES and the struggle over countries like Cameroon isn't really about ideology. It's about resources. The Sahel is one of the world's most resource-rich regions. We're talking about vast deposits of gold, some of the richest gold deposits on the planet. We're talking about uranium, which is becoming increasingly valuable as the world's energy demand shifts. We're talking about rare earth minerals, strategic metals, agricultural land in a world where food security is becoming an increasingly central concern. For decades, these resources have been extracted and controlled through systems that primarily benefited Western companies and Western interests. A French company owned much of the uranium mining in Niger. Western firms dominated the gold extraction in Mali and Burkina Faso. The profits flowed outward. The infrastructure was built to serve export, not local development. Local populations often saw minimal benefit from the extraction of their own resources. The AES represents, among other things, a challenge to this system. It's asserting the principle that African nations should control their own resources and should benefit from their own wealth. That sounds reasonable on the surface, but it has massive implications for global markets, for energy policy, for the supply chains that underpin modern economies. If the AES successfully consolidates control over the Sahel's resource wealth and establishes new partnerships, particularly with countries like Russia and China, to extract and market those resources, it fundamentally alters the global resource equation. That's not just an African story. That's a global story with immediate implications for developed nations that have built their energy and supply chain strategies around certain assumptions about access. And that's before we even get to the geopolitical implications. Control of uranium, in particular, is strategically significant in ways that go beyond economics. Uranium is nuclear fuel. It's tied to questions of military capability and energy independence. If major uranium-producing regions move outside the Western sphere of influence and align with rival powers, that's a meaningful shift in global strategic balance. It's not dramatic or immediate, but it's real. And it's exactly the kind of shift that happens quietly, through these seemingly technical decisions about regional alliances, until suddenly people look up and realize the world has changed. But that's not the full story, because the West isn't passively watching this happen. The response has been multi-layered and increasingly urgent. France, which historically has maintained the deepest military and economic ties in the Sahel, has already experienced the consequences. French forces have been withdrawn from Mali and Burkina Faso. French influence has declined dramatically. French companies are losing contracts. The relationship that France built over more than a century in West Africa is unraveling, and France's response has been telling. Instead of accepting the loss gracefully, there's been an effort to reposition and adapt. There's been an increased military presence in Senegal, in Ivory Coast, in Ghana, countries still within the Western sphere. There's been an effort to pivot toward maritime security concerns, to maintain a Western military footprint in the region even as the territorial control slips away. The United States has taken a similar approach. Rather than concentrate on the Sahel directly, there's been an expansion of military partnerships and security agreements in coastal West African nations, the ones that border the Atlantic. The logic is clear. If the Sahel is being lost to an alternative coalition, the priority becomes preventing that coalition from extending its influence to the coast. But that's a reactive strategy. It's about containment rather than expansion. And in geopolitical terms, the side that's building new coalitions and expanding its influence is typically in a stronger position than the side that's defending what it already has. What happened next changed the entire calculation. Because as the AES expanded and consolidated, the pressure cooker that had been building for years started to release in visible ways. Cameroon, sitting at the center of this struggle, became the flashpoint. But Cameroon isn't just any country. It's a member of multiple regional organizations. It has influence in ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which is the formal regional bloc for West Africa. It has separate involvement in Central African regional structures. It's also deeply connected to France historically and maintains security relationships with Western powers. This made Cameroon's position even more delicate. Any move by Cameroon in either direction would send massive signals to other countries and would be interpreted as a major geopolitical statement. The diplomacy around Cameroon became incredibly active. Delegations traveled back and forth. Offers were made. Pressure was applied. Economic incentives were dangled. Military support was promised or threatened. This was the invisible battle that was shaping continental politics. And it was tense because everyone understood what was really at stake. It wasn't just about Cameroon. It was about the future architecture of African power. If Cameroon moved toward the AES, it would likely encourage other Central African countries to consider the same move. You could see a cascade where the entire power structure of the continent shifted. But if Cameroon remained committed to Western partnerships, it would serve as a barrier, as evidence that the AES expansion had limits, as a way to preserve Western influence in regions critical to global economics and strategy. This brings us to something most commentary about African geopolitics misses entirely. The AES isn't just about rejecting the West. It's about constructing an alternative model for how African nations should relate to each other and to the world. The coalition is based on the idea of military cooperation between member states. It's based on African-led solutions to African security problems. It's based on the principle that resource wealth should benefit African populations rather than foreign corporations and investors. These aren't radical ideas, but they're fundamentally different from the framework that's governed the region for the past few decades. What makes the AES genuinely significant is that it's not just rhetoric. It's backed by concrete actions. Military cooperation between member states is actually happening. Forces are actually being deployed across borders, with member countries providing support to each other. Trade relationships are actually being restructured to reduce dependence on Western-controlled markets and pathways. These are real changes, not just statements of intent. And that's what makes the expansion of the bloc through additions like Guinea Bissau actually matter. Each new member strengthens the practical capacity of the alliance to function as an alternative power structure. Now, some analysts have suggested that the AES is simply a vehicle for Russian influence in Africa, that the member states are just trading Western dependence for Russian dependence. There's some truth to the fact that Russia has been supporting the AES, particularly militarily. But that analysis misses something crucial. The AES states are also engaging with other non-Western powers, including China. And more fundamentally, they're asserting the right to make their own foreign policy choices rather than having those choices made for them by their donors. That's not the same as simply replacing one patron with another. It's about agency. It's about Africans determining African futures. That said, the geopolitical implications are still massive. Because as African nations reassert control over their own affairs and their own resources, it necessarily reduces the space available for Western influence. It's not that the West is being kicked out through military force. It's that the ground is shifting. The relationships and assumptions that gave the West leverage are being replaced by different relationships and different assumptions. And in that new world, Western influence diminishes not because of external pressure, but because local players no longer need Western mediation or Western capital in the same way. Let's talk specifically about what changes when a country like Guinea Bissau aligns with the AES. It's not just political and military. It's deeply economic. Consider the maritime resources. Guinea Bissau has fisheries. Those fisheries have been heavily exploited by foreign fishing companies, many of them Western-based or based in other allied countries. The fish stocks belong to Guinea Bissau, but the profit from fishing those stocks has largely gone elsewhere. Alignment with the AES potentially creates new trading relationships and new frameworks for how marine resources are managed and monetized. That means wealth stays within the coalition, flows through African-controlled channels, and can be invested in African development. But it goes deeper. Trade patterns shift. If Guinea-Bissau and other AES members establish new trade corridors that don't run through Western-controlled ports or intermediaries, the entire commercial relationship changes. Port cities in Guinea-Bissau become more significant. The logistics and shipping industries that serve these new trade routes become more valuable. Companies that were excluded from old trade relationships because of political connections now become relevant because they're part of the new system. Over time, these shifts accumulate. An alternative economic system emerges that's based on African trade, African logistics, African control. That might not sound dramatic, but it's genuinely transformative. And here's the thing that makes it particularly significant. This is happening in a region that Western strategists have considered critical to their interests. The Atlantic coast of West Africa isn't peripheral. It's central to global trade routes. It's adjacent to one of the world's most important maritime passages. It's home to resources that matter globally. The idea that a coalition of African nations could consolidate control over this region and reshape it according to African priorities rather than Western ones. That's a fundamental challenge to an existing world order.